We are moving into our next session, Strategies for Confronting Anti-Semitism, Informing and Empowering Students, Teachers, and Members of the Public. In this session, we are bringing together an outstanding array of scholars from across the United States. Dr. Kirsten Fermaglich, Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Michigan State University. Dr. David Frey, Professor of History and Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Dr. Tony Michaels, the George L. Mose Professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Dr. Magda Teeter, Professor of History and the Schwindler Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham University. And today's program will be moderated by Dr. Jeff Weidlinger, the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Jeff is also the chair of the Academic Advisory Council here at the Center for Jewish History. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished panel.
Okay, hi everybody. Great to have you all here and great to see all of you. I only wish I were seeing you in person, but it's great to see you virtually anyway. And I hope you've been enjoying as much as I have today's conversations. Maybe enjoying isn't the right word, but learning from, appreciating all of the insight that we've been getting from today's conversation. So thank you again, all of you, for being here. So I guess we are going to be talking about anti-Semitism in academia and about teaching anti-Semitism and confronting anti-Semitism in our universities. I think it's interesting that we come from different types of universities, so it'll be interesting to hear the variation. We have, big state actually two big state universities well, three including me, big state universities in the Midwest. And then we have West Point, which is a military college, and of course Fordham, a Jesuit university in a big city. So different types of student bodies that we all deal with. So I think I'll begin by asking each of you in turn to answer the question that the panel topic, that the panel title is posing, which is really, what are some of the strategies that you've used to confront anti-Semitism and to inform and empower students and the general public about anti-Semitism? And we can go in the order in which you listed in the panel. So Kirsten, that puts you first.
Thank you so much. It's nice to see everyone, and thanks so much for inviting me. I don't know if I can share my screen, so I don't know if that'll be complicated, but I wanted to share with people a few of the different strategies that I use, which mostly deals with kind of how I use archives as well in my teaching and also in other kinds of campus activities. So I isolated like 4 different materials that I use that come from my research, which is about name changing, Jewish name changing in the United States, which is directly intertwined with the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States in the 20th century. And so one of the documents that, I don't know whether I can share or not, but one of the documents that I wanted to bring forward or talk with people about and that I share with my students every year is John F. Kennedy's application to Harvard in 1935, which is really fun for students to look at because of course they've filled out their own applications and yet asks questions, and it forces us to kind of talk about what do those kinds of questions mean and why are they there? Questions like, what kind of work what's your father's occupation? What's your mother's maiden name? And those kinds of questions let us both see the ways that the university is racializing Jews, marking them out as Jewish so that they can identify them and exclude them. And it also clearly identifies the strategies that Jews are using in order to avoid that kind of racism. I also have my students every year that I teach American Jewish history, we go to Michigan State University's archives. We actually have a fantastic collection of radicalism, which includes both left and right radicalism, and actually a very, very large anti-Semitism collection in particular of anti-Semitic ephemera. And so students are able to look at their own documents of ephemera that comes from a whole host of places, Nationalist Association, a lot of sort of materials from the 1930s, all the way up through the 1990s and today. I have a student using it today. And some of that material actually also I've used in my own research, and students really appreciate a chance to be able to look at those kinds of materials and identify and kind of isolate not only sort of the language that's being used, but trying to identify who wrote them, what they do with them. I've also used materials on internalized anti-Semitism by Jews. This also comes from my own research on Betty Friedan, who wrote a short story on Jewish anti-Semitism in the 1930s that was taken from a personal experience that she encountered at Smith College in the 1930s. And that, again, because it's a college situation of Jewish girls combining with non-Jewish girls to persecute a Jewish girl in their class who better fit kind of Jewish stereotypes. And she winds up having a nervous breakdown and having to leave school. But the kicker of the story is that the Jewish girl, who is the narrator at the very end, kind of just goes along with it and decides that this girl was really a problem and nobody really liked her anyway. So it's a really, really powerful way for Jewish and non-Jewish students, for all students to be able to think about stereotypes of Jewish women, which are really different from the stereotypes today in some ways. So that's really powerful for them. And also to be able to connect it to their own experiences and lives, and think about both, I don't love ideas about internalized anti-Semitism, but it allows students to see how pervasive it was and to see how marginalized these girls felt, that they felt the need to go along with this. And then the final document that I just wanted to share quickly is that we had some really ugly instances of anti-Semitism on our campus about a month ago, 3 of them within one weekend, which included one group chat where a student identified themselves with a swastika and talked about Jews as scum and wanting to take biology so that he could prove that. Really, really ugly stuff. And so in my conversation on anti-Semitism with my students this semester, we talked about that. I showed it on screen and we talked about sort of how the students in the chat responded, and what that meant for sort of Jewish students' identity on campus and how they see themselves. So sort of a broad range, mostly in the 30s and 40s, but also through to today, using a lot of kind of materials that people can get in libraries and archives, but also things that people can get elsewhere as well that I think have been really powerful in my teaching. And then the final thing that I just wanted to talk about is that I've also been doing a lot of, we have had these instances at MSU, and so there's been a lot of effort on the part of the Jewish Studies program to do outside of the classroom teaching. So we've been doing RA training, which I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in a couple of years ago. It's not regularized yet, and we're fighting for that. But we've done RA training that's used some of these materials. We're writing a guide now on anti-Semitism that we're hoping to share with students, faculty, and administration. And then we also were able to participate. There's a student-led multi-week kind of program of student-on-student teaching about sexism and racism and Jewish studies. I, along with my colleagues in Jewish studies, were able to work together with people in Muslim studies. So we created a unit that is on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that uses a lot of our materials, and it really sort of teaches people, tries to teach people sort of about anti-Semitism so they can recognize it. And that's been really successful as well. So I'm happy to talk about all those things, and I'm really super happy to be a part of the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. I'd love to see that handbook on anti-Semitism that you're compiling. So
maybe
you can share it with the school down the road at some point.
When it's done.
David, how about you? What are some of the strategies that you've used to confront anti-Semitism in the classroom and to inform and empower students?
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you to the conference organizers, my fellow panelists, our audience. You'll understand that because of where I work, I also need to start with a disclaimer. The views expressed today are my own. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or positions of the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of the Army, or the Department of Defense, or U.S. government. So in answer to your question, Jeffrey, I'll discuss some specific methods that we have for partnering with archives, museums, and cultural institutions to confront anti-Semitism here at West Point. So some of what we do is very similar to what probably you will hear from everyone else on the panel. We teach courses on the Holocaust and Genocide, and these courses are one of the few data-backed methods for reducing anti-Semitism and creating empathy, which other panelists or other panels have already talked about, and understanding of difference. We support lectures on anti-Semitism, which we open to the general public. We support research that directly engages the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. I'll mention 2 research programs specifically. We're part of a multi-university project on extremist narratives that target the military. A central part of this project is to look at how anti-Semitic tropes are currently being used, particularly in social media. The second is my project on World War II military intelligence training at Camp Ritchie, through which thousands of European Jewish refugees processed. Research into subjects that proactively target specific pillars of anti-Semitic arguments, such as those which claim that Jews are not loyal to the state or don't have willingness to serve. These are some of the ways that archives and researchers can help to combat anti-Semitism. So courses and long-term research engagements are one way of changing attitudes, but because of the way of where I work and within the military, I'm also aware of the opportunity that we have to use training to alter behavior. And the mix between training and education is a very specific niche in which I sit and where archives and museums can have very unique roles. My center's courses often involve partnerships with museums. Our donor funds support multiple annual trips to the Holocaust Museum in DC in order to promote understanding of the dynamics that lead to genocide and the responsibilities future officers have. We don't simply tour the museum. We have discussions, require reflections, meet with survivors, study Nazi use of law for purposes of discrimination, and discuss war crimes. We directly relate understanding of anti-Semitism to the vocation our students have chosen. My center also supports an annual slate of intensive study trips, which directly engage anti-Semitism or other forms of prejudice. And again, I'll mention two. We send a group of cadets to Poland in partnership with the Auschwitz Jewish Center to study Jewish heritage and the Holocaust. We send cadets to the Czech Republic to study the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich and to visit Terezin. These museum and camp-based in situ programs produce deep engagement, internalization of anti-racist ideas, which frequently lead cadets to do honors theses or produce or participate in or even create other anti-discrimination efforts. So why is West Point's engagement with archives, museums, and sites of memory so significant and unique? Well, I would argue, and I often do, because it can change and influence the entire armed forces. We've been able to help the Naval Academy create courses. The National Defense University created a brand new course on that directly engaged the Holocaust and anti-Semitism through study of genocide and atrocity prevention. Using partnerships and archival material, we've created a case study on leadership responsibility and officer ethics based on the decisions made by German army officers in Belorussia in 1941 when ordered to kill Jews. This case study, which we call the Ordinary Soldiers Case Study, is now part of the training done nationwide in the Reserve Officer Training Corps. I'll give you two other quick examples of long-term engagement across the military. In 2018, one of my former students, at the time a captain, led his entire logistics unit of approximately 80 people, then stationed in Germany on a 4-day professional development program to Auschwitz and Nuremberg, utilizing that Ordinary Soldiers Case study that I just spoke of as the basis for the trip, and working with the Auschwitz Jewish Center to help organize that program. In 2019, I worked with a former cadet deployed in an air defense artillery unit in Israel to create an annual collaboration with Yad Vashem, so that members of this unit, which often include 18 to 25-year-olds who have never learned of the Holocaust or even of Israel, and may never have even met a Jewish person in their life, to participate in a 1 to 2 day program devoted to better understanding the history of Jews. Just today, in fact, 20 US soldiers participated in this program. So I conclude with these programs to offer a touch of optimism. I know it's been hard to find those little touches of optimism today, but to illustrate also how West Point's partnerships with museums, archives, and cultural institutions allow us to educate, train, and most importantly, inspire anti-Semites. Programs and multiple points of engagement are what I would argue are the best way to combat anti-Semitism, and the last two programs I mentioned indicate that our collaborations can also create these second and third order effects that have potentially exponential impacts. This is how we inspire change, and to quote, or to pull from some of the earlier language, how we create upstanding leaders.
Thanks, David. And those really are important. And I have been involved with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as well, and I've heard about a lot of those programs. And yes, certainly the lessons of the Holocaust and the lessons of anti-Semitism in general are very important for our soldiers to learn and to understand. So I think we're all grateful, and that is a message of optimism that that's happening in the military. So I'm pleased to hear that. Next, we have Tony.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thank you. What I've concentrated on most in recent years when it comes to anti-Semitism, as an instructor anyway, is to teach it, which might sound banal, except that much of the field of American Jewish history has tended to minimize it as an important aspect of the American Jewish experience for a host of reasons that I don't need to go into now in my brief comments. So it was, it originally, I would teach it only episodically, which is to say, there were some incidents that one encounters over and over again in the scholarship, and I'd refer to those, maybe give a lecture on one or two things, but I didn't integrate anti-Semitism into the overall structure of the course. In recent years, I've moved towards doing that, towards integrating it into this course from the beginning, which is to say from the colonial and early revolutionary period to the present day. It's not, I found it's not easy actually to do that because it takes some conceptual work to figure that out. And I can't claim that I figured it out. But I've committed myself to doing that, to saying, and to do it. And so in doing that, I try to stress what is the institutional dimensions to it, the political dimensions to it, and the racist dimensions to anti-Semitism. So where at an earlier point in my career, I spoke about the Constitution as a document that all but granted Jews equal civil and political rights, while minimizing the fact that certain state governments did not do that. And that now I've changed that. I devote attention both to the federal Constitution and to, let's say, the Jew bill, the debate in Maryland over just this question. I spend a fair amount of time now on anti-Semitism in higher education, which students respond to, you can imagine, very, very, very well. I mean, which is to say they're eager to learn about systematic discrimination of Jews at every level of higher education between roughly 1920 into the 1950s, from admissions to hiring to student life and so forth. I talk about the way in which Jews are racialized as something other than non-white, and here visual materials are absolutely crucial. I show a cartoon from the press in the 1890s, and it's entitled, "What Jews Would Need to Do to Gain Admission into the Manhattan Beach Club." And it shows them, the cartoon, getting their noses chopped off by a guillotine or having their hair straightened. Something I think is very important, not only for understanding the past, but understanding the present, which is to say the persistence of racialized anti-Semitism in ways that go unrecognized mostly in contemporary discourse about Jews and race. And then a final example, more recently, which is to say from the 1960s forward, I now address anti-Semitism in a way I actually tended to minimize before. It's difficult to tackle. It leads inevitably or points to contemporary debates and with high levels of emotion and politics, which I don't want to inflame. But I feel that I need to, for the sake of the coherence of the course, end where I began, in a sense, which is to say there's an ongoing problem that runs throughout the history of the United States. One thing I've used recently is an interview with the white supremacist David Duke that I conducted 2 years ago. I have the transcript. I don't assign the transcript, but I use it verbally in the classroom. It can, I have some fear. I've had some fear that some students would object to that, but I haven't encountered that yet. Perhaps I would encounter that if I were to assign it, which I never would. So that's something to be absolutely avoided. So in these ways, these are just examples of how I integrate certain themes into the course. There's still the question of how to conceptualize American Jewish history, which I will just raise and leave aside, which is to say, if one thinks anti-Semitism runs throughout the history of Jews in this country, which is to say it runs throughout the history of America, then what is America? In my sense, in my view, the major works, the major surveys and textbooks and other things in American Jewish history have in my opinion, have failed to raise that question and scrutinize it adequately. So to me, then the next frontier, I think, for me anyway, in teaching anti-Semitism is to really grapple with some hard questions about what America is. Is it an unfolding story of democracy and inclusion, or is it something more uncertain?
Thanks, Tony. And I think that's the question that everybody would like to know, exactly what is America. So glad to have you asking it. We'll turn to Magda now, who not only teaches at a different type of institution, but also her expertise is in a different area than the other people on this panel as a medievalist, early modernist. So I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that as well. So I'll throw this same question to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to everybody. And I'm really honored to be included in this symposium. I have thought about this in a number of points. And one of the most important points, I think, in terms of addressing the question of anti-Semitism is the audience and reaching out, especially to non-Jewish audience, both in terms of teaching Jewish history and in terms of teaching about anti-Semitism. So for me, I think one of the problems and one of the issues that we're facing when teaching about anti-Semitism or even covering in the media anti-Semitism is that we tend to recount the instances of violence, of anti-Semitic incidents, and we tend to fit it in historical patterns of like the longest hatred and so on and so forth, without really offering an alternative language to think about Jews. So what the larger public gets is the recounting of persecution, it's the recounting of violence, and it's the only way the larger public can think about Jews. So for me, is the flipping of methodology, is changing it by diversifying the language and actually, and I think a number of people like Dariusz Stoła and others have mentioned to show Jewish history and Jews as participants in society in many different ways. And I do that in two ways. First, I teach both courses on anti-Semitism specifically and courses in Jewish history. But I've also integrated Jews in my surveys in European history and making them very central part of the European story rather than part of Jewish history versus European history. And I think that's one of the key moments, because it's the question, again, this is what Dariusz Stoła mentioned today, it's the question of we. Jews were Europeans and they were de-Europeanized later on in the modern period. And it's really crucial to make that material integral into the story, much like we need in the context of American history, integrate the story of African American history as part of the dominant narrative rather than this two separate tracks. So that's one thing. So teaching the whole wholesomeness of Jewish history is very effective. Students get a sense of diverse Jewish experience, the texture of Jewish life, and then they can also appreciate the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred and anti-Jewish prejudice and anti-Jewish laws. So they are able to distinguish between the law and the reality, between the living Jews, the real Jew, historical Jews, and the Jew as developed by anti-Semites. The other thing that I do, and I strongly believe in doing it, is teaching with historical artifacts, and I do so by bringing materials into the classroom, but also by collecting and using the special collections at Fordham. So we do buy Anti-Semitica, and we do buy some racist material, but we also obviously buy all kinds of materials that represent Jewish experience, Jewish culture, Jewish life. Again, that is with the mind of teaching and having students touch and see it. It's much different for students to see a postcard that was sent and written with "Hello, I'm having the greatest time," with anti-Semitic or racist images, than to me showing it on a PowerPoint presentation in the classroom. And I not only do I show, but I actually engage students to with assignments around these artifacts. You can see behind me a catalog. We actually produce exhibits that are then shown for them, and when the universities do finally open up to the public, also to the public. This one behind me is a fruit of my class on the history of anti-Semitism and its media technology and the dissemination of hate. And we did, again, look at the larger history from the medieval period until recent times on the use and transformations of technology and how it influenced the dissemination of hatred. And again, that also included not just anti-Semitic, but racist materials as well. And that leads me to another thing that I think it's really crucial not to single out anti-Semitism it has its unique qualities, but it is very important for our students to see anti-Semitism in the context of other types of prejudice and especially, again, given our context, also anti-Black racism. And so to do so, I teach a course on anti-Semitism and racism. And we talk about both aspects and historical context, using the methods that I've mentioned before. So for instance, when we talk about the Enlightenment, which I would do also in my European history class, we include materials by the famous Enlightenment writers on race and on Jews to contextualize the culture. So it's not seen as something strange and different, but it in fact is seen as developing from very specific moments and methods. And that also makes anti-Semitism and Jewish history, Jewish experience relevant to students who otherwise might not care about Jews or Judaism or anti-Semitism or anything else. And it also makes them understand the Holocaust, which they've heard about, but it usually springs up on them out of nowhere, and they don't understand why this happens. So essentially, the final thing that I will say is that the other tool that is, I think, crucial in empowering students and the public is to show examples of resistance and pushback. So in my collecting for Fordham, we've been also purchasing items that show that kind of resistance. If I were able to share my screen review, I would have shown you a couple of examples of that. But from early modern period, medieval is a little bit more difficult, but early modern period publications, both apologetic, like is Isaac Cardozo, Las Excelencias de los Hebreos, to some defenses of Jews against blood libels, to modern defenses or anti-racist texts, and this gives students tools to think about that there is always a ways to push back. There's always a ways to stand up. There's always there have always been people doing so. So it makes it a little bit less depressing that there is this horrible hatred that is coming through history, but it also gives them tools of thinking through that there are ways to stand up and push back. So I'll stop here. I'm sure we have a lot to discuss.
Yeah, there's a lot that you have all brought up, and we've got about 15 minutes to discuss it. So I'm going to actually raise two issues and then see which ones you want to respond to that are in slightly different formats, but that you all raised in some form. And I'll draw from my own experience as well. I've been teaching a course on anti-Semitism for about 10 years. And the way I do it is I actually teach texts about what people have written about the Jews. And that's a distinction between teaching anti-Semitism versus teaching confronting anti-Semitism. So many of you have talked about teaching strategies to confront anti-Semitism. But one thing that I have found is that my students don't recognize anti-Semitism when they see it. They're not familiar with some of what we recognize as the most basic tropes of anti-Semitism. The idea or the alleged threat of Jewish power, for instance. They don't recognize that as a theme. They think of anti-Semitism solely in terms of violence, of attacks at grocery stores or the Holocaust, other shootings at synagogues, but they don't recognize it in writings. So I do a class that teaches the image of the Jew. We read famous people, and we read some of the greatest thinkers of all time: Martin Luther, Karl Marx, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, the Gospels, William Shakespeare, and we read segments of what they wrote to see what they said about the Jews. And it's a fascinating experiment for them to recognize that some of the things they're hearing in their dorms that they wouldn't have thought of as anti-Semitic actually have a rich tradition of tropes about the Jews. And I think that tool helps them combat anti-Semitism. It helps them recognize it, and it helps them respond to it. So I wanted to just kind of raise that as one issue of the difference between teaching anti-Semitism and teaching responses to anti-Semitism. And then the other thing I want to raise also comes from my own experience here at Michigan, and you've all raised it, or some of you have raised it in some form, which is the relationship between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. And I'm going to raise it in one incident that actually happened here at the University of Michigan while I was teaching my anti-Semitism course. And by the way, I get a diverse group of students in this anti-Semitism course. It actually amazes me what a diverse group of students I get and why they're ending up in this class. But I guess it meets a lot of requirements, so I get them for a variety of reasons. But we had an incident on campus where somebody distributed racist literature and anti-Semitic literature together, like a pamphlet that was both racist and anti-Semitic. You can imagine how they're combined. And somebody was distributing this literature through the dorms. And there was a huge response at the University of Michigan from the African American students who were really upset about it. And there were all of these rallies and stuff, and there was a big to-do about it. Whereas the anti-Semitic statements and the swastikas, nobody really mentioned them. They were mentioned, but they weren't really talked about much. And in my class, we tried to discuss why that was the case. And the students concluded that, those of them who were Jewish could shrug it off, that this didn't pose an existential threat to them. They were comfortable at the University of Michigan and didn't feel that this threatened their comfort level. Whereas the students of color saw this as an existential threat and felt that this was a symbol to them that they are not welcome. And I thought that's an interesting distinction in the way that a lot of this literature, a lot of the anti-Semitic incidents on campus are felt compared to other types of racist incidents on our campuses. So anyway, I'd be curious to hear any of your responses on either of those two issues, the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism, or the relationship between teaching anti-Semitism and teaching confrontations of anti-Semitism. So any of you want to respond? Magda?
Sure. I totally agree with you. Students do not recognize what anti-Semitism is. I often show them images in my first class and have them vote whether it's anti-Semitic or not, and they don't know. By the end, we kind of, to combat it, we have to teach it. We have to teach them the vocabulary, whether it is the vocabulary of in the word, or whether it's the visual vocabulary that they might encounter. And yes, then this is exactly the same thing. They have no idea how long or what the roots of those tropes and ideas are. That's why, again, it's very important to show them, as you do and as I do in my classes, through the primary documents, again, whether they are visual or whether they are textual, and wrestle with the students over what's written and what it means, what it meant at the time, and how it then continued to feed once it became part of the reservoir of vocabulary and tropes in the history of anti-Semitism.
Thanks. And, Tony, you had mentioned about, I'll get to you, Kirsten, in a second, but Tony had mentioned that he doesn't let the students read the transcript of the David Duke interview. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that a little bit, why you don't, because they're going to hear that type of language elsewhere. So why not, and this is just to play devil's advocate, but why not deconstruct it with them so that the first time they hear it is with you in the classroom, able to combat it?
I don't, for a few reasons. One, I don't want it circulating beyond my control. It's not published, and I didn't conduct the interview for this purpose, so there could be legal ramification. The other is, well, they need. I think I can get them into the text or portions of the text by reading it and discussing it, rather than the other way. Which I think requires a fair amount, which is, say, to have them read it requires a fair amount of text context that they don't have on their own. And I'll give you an example. This actually bears out something you said a moment ago. I do assign a document from Father Charles Coughlin. Several years ago, I was sitting in on a discussion section, and I saw that 3 students out of 15 didn't think it was anti-Semitic. And part of the reason for that is the rhetoric didn't seem anti-Semitic. And here's what I mean by that. He didn't say, I hate the Jews, I'm going to kill them. He didn't even say all the Jews are communists and they deserve to die. What he said was something more finessed. Some people say that Jews, because of their support for Bolshevism, pose a, and then goes on in that regard. So it's framed as someone else's opinion. It's framed in a way that's not an allegation, but an observation. This was, so wasn't the problem here was that they couldn't recognize anti-Semitic tropes, is they couldn't see through rhetoric, a certain kind of rhetoric that was used to profess neutrality. So that to me suggests, again, that I can't just give them Duke, unadulterated David Duke, because David Duke was saying things, first of all, that sounded like multiculturalism. I want them to see that when David Duke talks about the rights of white people, he couches it not in genetics, although he does that too, but he also does it in the language of multiculturalism, which you could hear on any college campus. So that has to be parsed. When he denounces Israel, he does it in ways that aren't different from campus anti-Israel activists. They're almost identical. And I could go on like this. So I can't give it to them unfiltered.
Yeah, fascinating. I think you're right on that. That's one of the attributes of modern anti-Semitism. The way that modern anti-Semitism does infiltrate our student body is through exactly the mechanisms that Father Coughlin was using back then. That people are saying, or I heard, and we've all heard this on various news channels on television. So yeah, great point. Kirsten?
Oh, yeah. So I'm sorry, this is a little bit, it's following what Magda said and what you said as well. So in doing the work that we've been doing, both on this guide that I mentioned and also this program called Dialogues on campus, which is basically designed for students to teach one another about racism and sexism. We took it over to do anti-Semitism, and we looked at their sort of historical, they did it in a series of PowerPoints, and their historical PowerPoint on racism was kind of a litany of violence. And it was all designed to be completely transparent. Like it was obvious, right? It was obvious that people would understand completely what the racism was behind it. And we struggled with this for a few sessions, and we just sort of said, this isn't, the transparency of this and the visibility of this in an American context will simply not work for students. So the reason I was smiling the whole time you were talking about teaching tropes, Jeffrey, is that that's what we've been doing in both this for my past year and a half, 2 years. I've been, constantly sort of working with this idea of tropes, and we completely changed the dialogues for the purposes of anti-Semitism, simply because, in an American context, certainly, but obviously in a European one as well, and it was very interesting to think about this also, and it connects to your other question about thinking about other groups, right? That, something that worked in talking about African Americans in an American context, for us talking about Jews in an American context wouldn't have worked at all, because they needed the kind of translation that the discussion of tropes really offered for us. Right. So that's what I wanted to sort of offer.
Yeah. And David, and also I'd be curious, David, about your student body and what they know about. You said they don't know very much about Jews when they come in often, but I wonder what they know about anti-Semitism, if anything.
I think this is a a broad, if not nationwide, certainly global problem, that people don't recognize these tropes and don't recognize some of the basic concepts of anti-Semitism. So I don't necessarily see it as specific to my student body or to any of the student bodies we're talking about. What Tim was talking about earlier about conspiracy theories and what we see, especially online. I think this is part of the slippage that you saw in QAnon in particular, that people didn't realize they were going down the anti-Semitic rabbit hole. And even when they were there, they still didn't see it because they're not familiar with these tropes in the way we are in kind of an academic sense. So I think that there's some very critical history that we have to do. And I think that's one of I love to do conferences like this when my own discipline becomes something that we can self-justify. But I think this idea of critical history in particular, and then it's critical self-analysis. So I really like how, Kirsten, you were talking about using the Michigan State Archives. And I'm trying to do that with some of what I do at West Point. And it's not necessarily by looking for where is the evidence in the archive that people were specifically saying anti-Semitic things, but where are they studying eugenics and what we call kind of racial science? Where are they, adopting these populist concepts? Where were they inviting people like Father Coughlin to come and speak in the 1930s? These, I think, are some of the elements of critical history that we need to do more of so that we can actually look at the ways our own institutions contributed to the advancement or the deepening of the social acceptance of these very tropes that make them so hard for us to actually say, oh, by the way, that's a dangerous thought. And so that I think that's the direction that I hope we're all going. I think a lot of schools are beginning to do this in reference to their past histories with slavery. Like hopefully issues of anti-Semitism and others are other forms of hate and racism are next on the block.
Yeah. And on the Michigan Archives between Father Coughlin and Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent, we've got a lot in the Michigan Archives that we can use to teach on anti-Semitism. On the trope topic again, it reminds me of a particular example where I remember in a class somebody had brought up some news person who had made comments about George Soros controlling the media and controlling the banks and whatever else. And there were several people in my class who didn't understand why that was anti-Semitic and said, just because he happens to be Jewish, why does the allegation that he's controlling media and controlling the banks, why is that anti-Semitic? And that's precisely, you need to understand the history of anti-Semitism in order to see why that accusation is anti-Semitic.
Right, and that would also prevent this sort of outrage. Oh, Jews are always outraged about these things and they always see anti-Semitism in everything, right? Because many people do not, in fact, understand that history and that vocabulary that's seeped in. But of course, those who are anti-Semitic understand it very well. Right. So that gets translated to that audience.
Right, and I think that's exactly what that student was asking. The student who was, naively in a way asking, why is this anti-Semitic, wasn't challenging, wasn't trying to be difficult, but I think did have that notion of, isn't this just another, how do they see anti-Semitism in everything?
And I think I'll just say one sentence is that our work is necessary so students don't go on Google and type in why are Jews hated, because that is going to take them into these anti-Semitic sites, and then that will only reinforce these anti-Semitic things. So we have job to do, and I think there are great strategies that we're employing here that you've shared here.
Yeah, and hopefully our students will stay off the internet entirely, and then they won't encounter anti-Semitism there at all. But thank you all very much for these comments. I really appreciated this discussion, and thank you, Michael, for inviting us and for organizing this. And I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Kirsten, David, Tony, and Magda. We should all be so fortunate to hope that the future of education is in your hands and that students across this country and around the world will have professors and experts in their classrooms like you. So thank you so much for joining us.